focus on the issues highlighted in the supplementary item, especially how the new voting technologies affect both elections and observation missions. As the new voting technologies are already in use, there is a gap between the actual processes of elections and the discourse regarding them. With concerns regarding meddling from foreign actors in elections becoming more common, there is a need for discourse more about the matter. I would like to take the opportunity to highlight the importance of the guidance book about new voting technologies that was launched a couple of years ago. As such, we will discuss how new voting technologies offer both advantages and risks, how these risks can be managed and how election observation can adapt to this relatively new way of voting. I'm delighted to introduce Mr. Alexander Schlyk, Head of the Election Department of ODIHR, and Mr. Robert Kimmer, Professor of E-Governance at the Tallinn University of Technology. I give the floor to each of you to make an introduction of your expertise and suggest that you talk for 10, 15 or 20 minutes perhaps each, and that we after that open up for a discussion. I invite the audience to raise questions that we share a discussion on the topics. So first I will give the floor to Mr. Robert Kimmer, please.
Thank you, Mr. Söder. Dear audience, dear participants, thank you for inviting me and for having me here in Berlin. It's always great to come to the German capital. Being Austrian myself, of course, although I live for some time now in Estonia, so up north, we appreciate the warm weather. That said, we live in times where not only the weather is changing, but of course also our society is changing. From one where we recognize all of each other as equals and have, so to speak, a face-to-face society where we can also organize our political processes in such a way, to a territorial society which we mainly live today with, in the boundaries, we organize the political process. However, through the introduction or through the availability of information and communication technologies and worldwide networks, we can basically say that we don't live in a territorial society anymore, but rather a global society that really allows us to be wherever we want in the world and still participate in the political processes where we actually want to engage ourselves. So with this availability of the internet, it really changes our life. It allows us to be more mobile, it allows us to actually be thinking global. But in the end, for our democracies, not much has changed, right? So we still have a decreasing voter turnout. That actually, since the early 90s, has constantly been going down. We have a felt distance between the rulers, meaning you as parliamentarians, and the ruled, the citizens. So there is not this unity anymore that they feel like they're engaged. And we also have, through the migration waves of the recent past, many more languages that are being spoken within a territory. And so there is a need for more communication, for more support for that. I mean, most recently we have maybe seen that Skype allows us to actually have simultaneous translation of a Skype call, right? So we are getting really advanced with our technologies that maybe at one point the communicator that we have all seen as kids in Star Trek might actually be a reality one day. So the big question that there is for democracy is using electronics actually a way forward. And it's not something that is just an idea of today or of the last couple of years. It actually has been posed as soon as we had electricity actually being available. So the question that it puts forth is, how can we use or make use of IT in our electoral process in the best way forward? Before I will go into that into more detail, I still want to come back to something that has happened here in Berlin some 29 years ago that was actually setting, or that was continuing the bringing down of the Berlin Wall with the municipal elections here in Eastern Germany, where actually, despite the fact that there was a unitary list, it was possible to falsify the election by actually striking everyone off the ballot. And still the election administration had an interest to basically have a race for the biggest support of all, so for the 100%. And so citizens stayed in the polling station to observe the number of of invalid votes. And so the big question is, when we actually will use IT, how will it be possible to observe, to see, to check, to falsify an election when a regime that basically is not following democratic practices is running the election, right? And that's the big question. So using IT might be good, but how can we actually then also bring down a regime that is not trustworthy? So what are the two main challenges with using IT in the election? The one inside, the first one is really clearly secrecy, right? When we have an election is essentially about distributing information. On the one hand side, making sure that only eligible voters are participating in an election, and on the other hand, to make sure that the cast vote is kept secret, right? And in a regular paper-based election, you do that by having a desk, a registration desk, and then handing out a paper ballot to the voter that goes then to a ballot booth to cast a vote and then come back and put it into a ballot box. So it's a clear separation of information. Would you have full information available? There is no secret election. That's something to always bear in mind. There is one piece of information that links every voter to his or her vote, and that's the fingerprint, right? If you have a fingerprint database, there is no secret election. And similarly, the problem in IT is that you always have perfect information, right? The only question is, how hard can you make it to put all those different pieces of information together, right? So essentially, the point about linking casting a vote and the voter is actually multiple ways. It could be through IP addresses, it could be through messages, it could be through sequence, it could be through time. So it is a very difficult IT challenge. So that's the first thing, right? You're not allowed to be able to link them one way or the other. And the other challenge that we have is actually transparency, right? So the big difference between paper elections and electronic elections is really the one, how can you touch, feel, and see a bit and bite, right? We can't, right? So this immediate possibility to take account of the proceedings that we can have with paper is not possible with IT, because we can't see the inner parts of the IT system. So it is very difficult to provide this accountability, this transparency. So having laid out those two main challenges, I will come back later how those are being solved in technical systems. But let me start off with saying that this problem, these challenges have been discussed since the very beginning of electricity, and every parliament actually around the world has faced some kind of debate in the 19th century already, when a big inventor such as Thomas Edison, such as Werner von Siemens, here in the Prussian parliament actually proposed to use an electric system for casting votes for parliaments. Carl Ericsson did so in Sweden as a link. And here you can see on this picture the first system that was proposed by Thomas Edison, and on the right it was a system that was proposed by Werner von Siemens. So people that have a technical mind, they always think about this democratic process as actually a promoter for their ideas. So why do they think about that? I mean, it's something that is not out of the ordinary, because you think about automation of processes. You think about making sure that you cannot cast an invalid ballot unintentionally, right? You want to have better accuracy, you want to have better reliability, you want to have better accessibility by allowing blind voters to vote, for example. You want to increase logistics, you want to include voters that are not in the polling station, like, for example, diaspora. You want to be showing that you're a technological leader, actually, and that's something that is very strong, in particular when you talk about introducing new voting technologies. And you always have the hope that there is less costs and resources involved on the long run. In the beginning, everybody accepts that they invest certain things on that, but on the long run, it will appreciate. However, we all know that we have to keep investing into a technological system, and if you think about one that you only use every 4 years, that's one that is probably most doubtful of all. So what are challenges next to those that I've mentioned before? We talk about IT literacy, we have the problems of dependency on technology, we have the issue of transparency, as I said already, we have the problem of trust. So it's not only about not being able to understand, but you also need to trust that device, that you don't know how it works, right? And that has been also discussed very early on We have the issue of data protection, which of course is a strong issue for the German Bundestag. And of course we have the issue about voter coercion and vote buying, and of course of the secrecy of the vote. So let me try to structure the forms of electronic voting with new voting technologies. They can be done actually by two dimensions very easily. On the one hand side, where is the casting of the vote taking place? So which you can see here with the place in a controlled environment, such as a polling station, or in an uncontrolled environment like the home of a voter. And the other dimension is being, how do you record the vote? Do you record it on paper, or do you record it on electronic means? So when we take the first two means, then we talk about classical polling station voting using ballot sheets in a controlled environment. And if we transliterate that to the uncontrolled environment, we're talking about postal voting, right? So that's the regular forms that we have in many countries, including Germany. And if we take that into the electronic world, then we talk about voting machines in polling stations, meaning a controlled environment that the election commission is controlling, that only eligible voters participate. And if we talk about uncontrolled environment, we talk about internet voting, right? That's the thing that everybody thinks is easy to do, but there is actually only one country in the world that has introduced internet voting without any precondition, and that's Estonia. Switzerland is following suit with some limitations, but basically it's only Estonia that does it. Nobody else has even dared to introduce it. And then there's a third type of new voting technologies, and that's the so-called ballot scanners, which record the vote on paper but count them electronically, right? So how has the development been in the recent past? We had basically up until 2000, nobody cared about electronic voting machines. They were used all around, including in Germany, but nobody really thought it's an issue. They thought it's good, but it's expensive. Up until the 2000 elections in the US, where the voter card system actually failed, right? So the Florida 2000 election actually brought about that voting machines could be improving elections, and in the end, they became a black box system, and there's a need for a paper audit trail. Paper audit trail means that after you cast your vote on electronically, you get a paper printout to check how the vote was recorded electronically. And that is, I would say, a precondition for trusting voting machines, that you have the possibility to recount the election. The second type of, as I mentioned before, ballot scanners mean that you vote on paper, just like you did before, but you put the paper ballot into a ballot box and then put them into a scanner to count them electronically. And the last form, being internet voting, is the one that is in use in Estonia as the only country so far in the OC area on a significant level. So let me try to summarize. Electronic voting and new voting technologies are very complex, right? They have to solve the issues of an election, of making sure that only eligible voters vote and that they vote in secrecy somehow. It's a particular problem when they have to solve both processes at the same time, such as internet voting, right? Where you have to make sure that the voters are eligible and they cast their vote. You need to assess actually the context, the content, and the process, right? So you need to look at the IT system, you need to look at the process, how it was introduced, and then you also have to look at the context in which it has been done. New voting technologies should be about supporting the people and not about supporting the politicians, right? It is about the citizens after all, and that's an important part there. Observing new voting technologies should be an integral part that people think about when introducing the systems. The observation of new voting technologies takes significantly longer than traditional paper-based elections, and you need proper education and qualification of polling station officers, of technical operators, and of course, last but not least, the observers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kramer, for that great overview. I now give the floor to Mr. Alexander Schlick. Please.
Well, thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak about the observation of new voting technologies. Definitely, as we were discussing before the event, still an emerging topic. Has been emerging for quite a while now, but it is an interesting and quite a fascinating area of development in the electoral field. To begin with, I'll start from a bit more general point on the technology in the electoral process as a whole before going into the specific new voting technologies. Okay. So you can see very different applications of technology in the electoral process. Very obvious one, something that is being talked about quite extensively these days, is e-campaigning. Campaigning by the virtue of the internet, and that is something quite contentious lately. It has become the focus of attention, and you can see on the slide that every issue is linked also to a very specific commitment or standard that is related to it. So what we are looking at the campaigning, be it online or offline, we're assessing it primarily for it being genuine, but also free. Online voter education. It is important that it is inclusive and not targeting specific voters with a specific political affiliation. Electronic candidate nomination related obviously to the suffrage rights, and here there's a lot of advances made in terms of how the document process goes with submitting the documents and registering candidates. Voter registration, electronic voter eligibility verification, both related to universal suffrage and the realization of the right to vote. Multiple voting channels, something that Robert has been just talking about as well. Equal secret. Electronic vote counting and tabulation, obviously related to the expression of will. Important to maintain that what is cast is actually counted, and what is counted results in the allocation of mandates. As Robert mentioned already, three things that we are looking at in the definition used by the OECODIR is new voting technologies in terms of internet voting, touchscreen machines, ballot scanners, everything that has to do with the actual casting, counting, and tabulation of votes. So in the term of new voting technologies, we are not specifically looking at the issues of voter registration, for instance, or candidate registration, and those are looked at within the parameters of observing those specific parts of the process. Assumptions for the new voting technologies, and I use the word assumptions here because these are some kind of self-evident issues before anybody delves into more details on it. Obviously, new voting technologies can offer additional functionalities. Counting could be very complicated. I always tell the story of the elections in Ireland, where the commissions were looking always for the people who are affiliated with chess clubs because of the complexity of how the counting goes. And at a certain point, they thought maybe we should introduce some electronic counting. And with the reallocation of votes, with the preferential vote system and the transferable vote, the counting took place within a couple of hours. Nobody was happy about it. People loved looking at the result counts for 2 days, maybe staying in pubs and following that. So they were not huge fans of introducing the technologies, but it did facilitate the counting. New voting technologies also create challenges with their use. One important thing that I will be repeating several times today is that technologies are not the means to build trust in the elections. Technologies require trust to actually help the electoral process. And the choice of technology is a decision for each country to make. ODIHR respectfully treats all our participating states and does not recommend a specific technology. However, we do engage in very long discussions about what is happening with the technologies. What we see across our 57 participating states is that yes, there is an increased emphasis on new voting technologies in electoral processes. Many are using, many are exploring. There is if I had to speak about a general trend with NDT, there is a bit of a move towards the use of ballot scanners. But the scope of implementation, the magnitude of it varies very much. And it is not always a move from no technology to technology. Sometimes our participating states decide to take a step back and withdraw technologies from their electoral processes. So it's not a one-way sort of end of history direction. What we focus on as well, and what the states focus on, is that the use of NVT is in line with obligations and good practice for democratic elections. We will be getting back to that as well. We have a long history of observing new voting technologies. I'm not going to list all of these countries. You can see them in the brackets. You will see the years. when we were already following these processes. Some of this was happening even before we published the handbook on the observation. Yes. This is the handbook. I brought a couple of copies. Obviously, you can download it. It wouldn't be a proper handbook on NVT if you couldn't download it. But it is here. I also brought some USB sticks with all our handbooks on it, so the NVT handbook is also in there. I'll be happy to leave them here for those interested. The handbook is a reference material. It is something that we use as all our methodological tools to make sure that we observe NVT consistently across the countries where we work. And it is focusing on assessing processes and implementation. And processes is a very complex part of the NVT. We not only look at the use of NVT, we also look at how the new voting technologies get introduced. It also, importantly, provides guidance on how to observe the new voting technologies. There are generally 7 principles for observing new voting technologies. Some of these Robert has mentioned either directly or has already alluded to. For us, those boil down to vote secrecy, something Robert's been talking about, integrity of results, equality of the vote, universality of suffrage, transparency, accountability, and something that I highlighted, public confidence. We'll be speaking more about public confidence, but as I said, technology does not create trust. Technology needs trust to be fully functional and healthy. What we look at during the observation of NVT follows exactly these 7 principles. I wanted to also focus today on something that might be useful for you as decision makers in your parliaments. If you are thinking of moving towards technology, if you are thinking of how to make the first steps, I wanted to offer some additional ideas on what you might want to consider. Speaking from this perspective is not only exclusive to your role as decision makers in your parliaments, because these are exactly the same questions that we would be asking all our observers to focus on when they would be coming to observe elections. As you know, we quite often cooperate on it, and I'll be speaking a little bit more about what the parliamentarians coming around election day could be focusing on specifically when they are observing elections that use the new voting technologies. First and foremost, what we speak about when we are discussing with the participating states about their ideas to introduce technology is the feasibility. The first and fundamental question is, did you assess what is the problem that you want to solve? Did you assess what are the costs associated with solving this kind of problem? This is running a cost-benefit analysis considering advantages both in terms of democratic process and costs and in terms of all other issues that Robert has already mentioned, including, for instance, IT literacy. These 2 fundamental questions and approaches should lead to the specification of requirements as the result of the feasibility study. After the feasibility study is done and the decision is made in principle, what needs to follow very often is the legislation. Is to legislate and regulate all parts of the process, the setup of technologies, certification, data destruction, recount, what happens if the results don't match? What happens if there's 1 vote missing? It doesn't seem like a big deal, but I'm sure many of you have been running in elections where you have been winning by quite narrow margins. So where there is 1 vote, there could be 1,000. And then the results hang. One important thing that we discuss and we ask the observers to look at as well, maybe in a more long-term process, is the role of how did the procurement take place and the role of the vendors in it. Very often we know that the process is supposed to be run by the government authorities, by the decision makers, but the vendors are very actively involved, promoting this or that kind of technology. Nothing uncommon, we all know that this takes place, we have nothing to do with this. What is important to remember is that all process needs to be run by the decision makers, not the vendors. because this is the area where very often the specific technical knowledge is lacking, and somebody with the technical knowledge can not only help to solve the existing problem, but can describe or even imagine a problem that needs to be solved, which could lead to an introduction of technology that is not actually solving anything that is existing in reality. What we also ask our observers to look at is how are the specifications for the introduction and the run of the new voting technologies. What about security? Sometimes we do go into the locked server areas where the servers are hosted, and we do ask the very interesting questions of who has access, how is this recorded, who has the keys, what is the plan for unauthorized access consequences mitigation, and then the big question that we ask, where is it all written that you have just told us? It is one thing to talk expert to expert and to understand how things are. It's a slightly different thing when you need to record all of these steps in terms of regulations, procedures, and legislation. All of this we review as observers, and we ask our observers, including on election day, to ask these questions. One important thing to talk about is the secrecy and integrity of the new voting technologies. This is something that is very high on the agenda when there are discussions of possible foreign interference that is not foreign, by domestic actors who are malevolent or are involved in politics. So this is one important area where a lot of work is now being done. There have been discussions on how to use new voting technologies, how to introduce them. But now a lot of attention is being paid to the very specific topic of cybersecurity. And I think this would be the next step for us as the observers to analyze in terms of methodology on how to evaluate the work being done to address the cybersecurity threats. As you can see, once again, we're talking about the formal separation and responsibilities and duties. One thing that we sometimes see is how the electoral process is getting outsourced. That is for a good reason on the face value. Sometimes the Commission faces a political decision to introduce new voting technologies, but sometimes the Commission is sort of lagging behind in terms of their own IT literacy and their ability to run the process. Sometimes, for that reason, they choose to contract an external party, very often a private actor, a company, to run a specific parts of the process. Then the big fundamental question comes of who bears the responsibility, and does bearing the responsibility require full knowledge of what is being done in the electoral process? One would hope that even when you outsource the process, you only bear the responsibility when you understand everything. In reality, that is not that easy, and that is not that simple. And those are the kind of questions that we ask. One thing that helps very often is the meaningful random hand recount, or even a full recount possibility in terms there is a discrepancy in the results. That is something that we very much advise the participating states to think about at the early stages of introducing new voting technologies. And that goes back to the mantra that I will keep repeating, that the trust is needed. It is very hard to maintain trust in the system when technologies get introduced, this black box that nobody knows what is happening inside of, and things go wrong. And there's no way to go back. So that is why the early stages is quite important to have a possibility of a hand recount. Hand recount is only possible when you have a paper trail or a paper verifiability mechanism. And here I start using technical terms for which I apologize, but that is all in the handbook, an extra advertisement for it. It's all decrypted in there in the rather humane language. Yes, we tried hard when we were writing, so it's understandable not only to the tech geeks, but to general public as well. One thing that I was already starting to talk about is the testing and certification. Those are quite important elements as a steps in introducing technology. What we ask as a question is, have the real world end-to-end tests been conducted? from the beginning of the casting of ballots until tabulation of results. And sometimes the results of this test lead to the decision to either postpone or cancel the idea of introducing technologies. It doesn't look very good, it doesn't look very presentable for those who have been making these decisions, but it is important because the consequences can be quite drastic if that happens in real life. Here in the certification, in the certification as well, there could be independent bodies involved. Those could be government bodies, let's say a board of auditors, a state audit committee, but here again, the documentation and the delineation of responsibilities is extremely important. The next thing is the verification. One concept that is quite interesting is the voter verified paper audit trail, VVPAT in short, and that is something as if you're getting a receipt after you have voted, but the receipt that cannot demonstrate how you voted. A code that is only understandable to you as a voter. And that is something that we very much recommend because that allows the voter to see that the result of the process of voting is actually something that the voter has intended. But at the same time, it needs to be impossible to verify for a third party of how this voter has actually voted, to maintain the secrecy. One key thing for transparency and accountability of any NBT system is the observer access. And here we touch upon both the technological access. One thing that we always underscore, we are not hackers. We are not there to try and test the system by trying to get into it. That's not what we do. We respect the sovereignty of states in running their elections, and we are observing from the outside. However, to have meaningful observation of the black box, we need to have access to everything that describes the exterior of the black box and some elements of what is inside of the black box. And that is where the legislation, proper legislation for observer access, is so fundamentally important. Technology does require additional measures to increase accountability and transparency. It is not as simple to observe the technological process as it is to take a look at whether the ballot box has been sealed properly. You don't need special preparation for that. But on the contrary, if you are facing the technology that you need to observe, you can quite easily be prepared to do that. There's nothing fundamentally challenging in there. It is difficult, but it is absolutely doable. And here again, the handbook is of a great help. One thing to conclude with, we do have a methodology to observe new voting technologies. It is being developed as the technology gets developed. What we underscore always, and it is both the technical and the political message, is that trust and public confidence are prerequisite for the new voting technology. Proportional and gradual approach are key for any introduction of NPT. It needs to be a step-by-step process, potentially with pilots, potentially with going back away from the technology. Nothing wrong with that. This is not where the fancy technology justifies the process. Early stages are especially important, and early stages can take a very long time. There could be extensive discussions, and there need to be extensive discussions. Proper procurement, as you know, as the members of parliament who control the government, proper procurement takes time. It's hard to imagine procurement of a system that would guarantee secret accountable voting in several months. Nonetheless, we sometimes see such initiatives, but very often those several months are enough to understand that it's not going to happen. One last point is that new technologies are just new technologies for the same process, for the same elections for which the commitments and standards exist, and the new technologies should be in line with the existing commitments and obligations for democratic elections. It is with this that we approach the observation as well. Thank you for your attention. I'll be happy to answer all the questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Schrik. I now will give the floor to the audience for questions, so we can share a discussion on this topic.
Thank you. stakeholder approach is very important one. I remember we discussed this issue in Chisinau on referendum voting, and I think maybe it is the future. And the digitalization of election, of course, is very important, but how about the present? You know, in Moldova, we have such a process, they are digitalized. I speak here about the updating of electoral lists, of tabulation of results of the elections, but of course not the voting process himself. This is another issue. But you know, in Moldova and Chisinau, currently new technology, the internet, social media, penetrated the electoral process and the electoral campaign. For example, in Chisinau, the court declared invalid the local elections because of an illegal campaign on the day of elections via Facebook. And you know, the question is, how do you think? How can the internet, social media, new technologies, fake news by internet can influence the correctness, the fairness of the electoral campaign? How can we ensure that all electoral actors involved in the electoral campaign have equal conditions and possibilities? Because now I think we go forward on this development of new technologies, and of course I think they could influence the democratic process. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Don't know who will answer.
No, you don't want to.
Okay, yes, please.
I can answer that.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Mr. Silva. We've had discussions on that, and I can say you wouldn't be a politician if you wouldn't ask a political question here. And I wouldn't be an election expert if I wouldn't bring it back to principles, commitments, and standards and the underlying issues that we're looking at. I think you're pointing towards something that is quite salient these days. This is not exactly about new voting technologies, the essence of your question, but it is about technology, that is for sure. And I think one of your questions is the fundamental one. How can the use of technology ensure equal conditions? And I think here is the obvious link between the offline and the online world. What we see very often in our observation is the restrictions that are placed on the ability to campaign freely, and occasionally, and I can say a bit more often than previously, on the freedom of expression in the traditional media. We can also see that happening to a certain extent with regard to the internet. Here, however, the big question is, who do we consider media on the internet? And this is where the term social media is quite misleading, to me at least. I much prefer the term social networks. The term social media presumes in a way that these are media. From the perspective of standards and commitments, and if you look at, for instance, the General Comment 34 to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, it's very clear that this is all about the ability to convey messages, be it online or offline. Online domain is just another venue for conducting a campaign. Be it on Facebook, be it on the blogs, be it on your own webpage. This is just another venue. I try to think about it as just another square in the center of a town. Here, however, one important thing is quite evident, is that on the square in town, some people think twice before using inflammatory language, before using hate speech occasionally. they think twice about it, because we are used as societies to countering these kind of improper behavior in the offline domain. In the online domain, the barrier to using this kind of terms or hate speech in the campaigns is a bit lower, which doesn't mean that it does not to be countered, but it needs to be, I think the fundamental thing to maintain is the freedom of expression, and of course countering hate speech goes automatically, but it's not about regulating the online. It is about countering problems. And if the extent of the regulation is limited to countering obvious problems and not to controlling the speech, then there is a chance that the internet and the technology would allow for equal or potentially even more equal ability to inform and to reach out to voters.
I think you're touching upon a very important issue, right? I mean, when you said, like, how can we promote equal access, how can we actually provide for a fair campaign online, then we challenge basically two norms, right? The first one, when I started off, I was talking about the global society. And the point is that we all believed when the internet came about that it's actually a tool for providing freedom of speech, for more plurality of opinions. The reality, however, is that actually the number of opinions, the number of access to information has been reduced, right? So while we had, or what we have in the offline world, we have actually quite a diversity of media. We see actually through the electronic media congregation towards 1, 2, 3, 4 media outlets, and that's it, right? So we see actually that rather than having more diversity, we see much more of the same, right? It might have different brandings, different labels, but in the end, we all converge to very few websites. We use Google, we use maybe Google News, we use other forms of accessing this one media site. And the problem with that is that those social networks, as Alex Schlick pointed out before, are too strong by now to just be regulated by one country alone, right? Because it is a standard, technology has basically taken over the definition from the legal world. And it's hard to actually regulate that and to get access to that. We see that only now, it slowly but steadily starts to being tackled on the financial aspects of it, right? With the European Parliament or the European Commission trying to tax actually e-commerce also in the US, right? So there is certainly a need for developing certain standards and actually getting back or getting a hold of that process. When we talk about freedom of speech and talking about fake news, I mean, it's of course a very, very tight balance, right, that we have to strike. Because as soon as we start to get rid of fake news, who says, like, what is a fake news and what is true news, right? So that is certainly something to take into account. And how we're going to tackle it, I think nobody has an answer to that, but it is certainly one that we have to start thinking about.
Thank you. Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Emin Hüseyinov. I'm human rights activist and journalist from Azerbaijan. Our organization focused also on election observation, especially online election observations. Last two elections, we tried to, with a small group of volunteers, observe via online because most of us live in exile. And 20% of all polling stations in Azerbaijan, we have totally approximately 5,000, and 1,000 of them equipped with a CCTV camera system, which is not high quality, but enough to just check how many people come and put ballots to the voting boxes. And in our experience for last snap elections at 11 April, we observed for official statistic, what we will check via CCTV cameras, is at least 3 times smaller compared with official statistic which is declared by Azerbaijani government. My question is to experts and to also from representatives from ODIHR. For example, why ODIHR still don't use this methodology? You make good presentations, and I'm sure for you have much more skills for which we have. But still in Russia, for example, it's maybe I think most of the polling station from Vladivostok until Kaliningrad equipped with CCTV camera system, but still ODIHR didn't use methodology which is possible, easily to possibly recognize how many people attend to election, because in Russia Navalny says they make call for boycott, and they are proved statistically for people not attended to elections. In Azerbaijan, same thing happened because opposition called for boycott. People didn't come, and even people which is attend under administrative pressure and members of the carousels. This is incomparable with statistic what we fixed via CCTV camera. My questions, that's it. Thank you very much.
I will just answer on the technical level and then on the more institutional level, I'm sure Alex will be referring to that. So I mean, I think from a purely technical aspect, I think it's a fascinating opportunity, right? That you have an official camera feed, that you actually use technological means such as AI maybe to identify what's happening on the camera and on the camera feed, and then to count, as you have said before, how many people actually appear on that. Of course, I would say that there are certain limitations to the technology, just without having looked into that more in detail, that it's, do you really cover everything of a polling station, and it's only you might have outages, and still, it certainly gives you a certain kind of information. But I think when we talk about election observation, it is not a technical exercise, right? It is an exercise that actually represents feedback. It's a peer review for an electoral process, right? It is about people that have gone through a similar system, either as voters or as candidates or as politicians, as elected officials, of going to another country, of changing the context and providing feedback of what they have taken account of themselves, right? What you're talking about is probably not a bit of a different effort. It's an effort of the citizens themselves to provide accountability, to double check, to check the authorities for their account, right? And to use electronic means for doing so. It can only be part of a larger process. But of course, why not should it be an element that actually supports this? But you need to always, if you would do that across countries, I would say that's probably quite a bit of a technical challenge. We need to have the technological means as an institution. But for me, I think the most important thing is about humans going to another country and providing their peers with feedback, and that cannot be replaced by technology.
I'd actually continue much in the same vein, because I think the very premise of your question is that you were not able to deploy observers in person to the polling stations. So I think quite an interesting question is what would any observer organization prefer to do, especially the citizen observer organization, go in person to the polling station or focus on the coverage through the web cameras? One reason why we do not do monitoring through the web cameras is because they are not present everywhere, and there is a selection bias in terms of where they are present versus where they're not present. So it's only, they're not everywhere, and we are able, through our deployment of observers, to have a much more representative sample and counter this selection bias by sending people to a variety of places, both with cameras and without cameras. At the same time, if you see, many of you I've seen in the election observation missions, so you remember in the forum, you were always asked how many people have voted so far, how many people have voted during your presence in the polling station, and also marking the time of when you arrived and when you left. These three figures, these three parameters together allow us to reconstruct the turnout figures throughout the day. So we do know what is happening with the turnout, and we are able to compare it throughout the day to the officially reported figures, and also to the figures that are reported in the end of the day as official results. Our findings can be quite fascinating, I can tell you that. One thing, however, is that in our work as observers, we are not the election police. We are not there to catch by the hand the wrongdoing. What we are there for is to focus on the recommendations on how the process can be improved. The most fundamental thing to formulate a recommendation is not only what happened, but also why and how it happened. And observing things on the distance does not allow you to answer the questions of why and how at all. It can allow you to answer a portion of the question of what, but it does not allow to formulate recommendations that would actually address the core of the problem. And that is why we ask our observers to engage in discussions with the Commission members, with voters, with civil society representatives, with political party representatives, and to report all of those findings to us when they get aggregated and they get analyzed, also compared or explained in a way by observation of the long-term processes. It's very important to often distinguish between the malevolent wrongdoing, the purposeful defrauding of the elections, and mistakes that could result from lack of training or could result from the lack of understanding of procedures that could be too complex potentially. Those are two very different categories of problems on election day. And to understand our participating states, we need to have a discussion rather than an automated account of what is happening. Nonetheless, I think it's important for when the citizen observers are limited from performing their role, their very important role in democratic societies, to engage in at least some kind of manner, while understanding the limitations of this. But as you started your question as well, it is very regretful that in a number of countries, citizen observation is either not allowed by law or not allowed in practice.
Thank you. Mr. Heider, please.
Thank you, Robert Heider from Austria. I've been in several election observation missions, and in Kyrgyzstan I first met those new voting technologies, and I have to say, right at the beginning, I'm a strict opponent of all of those new voting technologies. My first problem is the registration of voters and citizens. In that country that I mentioned, it was so that only those who registered first with all their biometrical data, eye scan and 10 fingerprint scans, only those who registered a month before were allowed to vote. So all the others, they don't want that, and we have to, as politicians, we have to accept that somebody doesn't want his state to have all his biometrical data. We deny them their citizen and civil rights. So this is really a main point. If somebody decides that he does not want to give all his biometrical data to the state, we have to accept this and not deny him his civil rights. We need the transparent state, the transparent government, the transparent executive, and not the transparent citizen. This is how I see politics. But maybe this can be solved. But I see this only be solved with paper and not with technology, this problem. This is the first problem I have. I will have three problems. Second problem, ballot box scanners. When you are registered with all your biometrical data to have your ballot, and then there's a ballot box scanner, we all know what the saying in technology. All the misuse you can think of will be done. It will be done. And nobody will tell me that there cannot be a connection between the vote and the voter. So this is my second problem with new technologies. There will be. Third problem, internet voting, the secrecy of voting. You will never have secrecy of voting when you allow internet voting. You have the same problem in countries like my country, Austria, with letter voting. You all know maybe 2 years ago we had to repeat the presidential election because of our stupid system of letter voting. I will forbid that too. The right to vote is so heavily reached, so much tears, sweat, blood were given to have the right to vote. So people should have time to go into a polling station and give their vote. This is what I believe. But letter voting or internet online voting, you can never guarantee the secrecy of vote and selling of vote. This is, I can prove to everybody who wants to sit beside me what I voted, and then I get the money for that. Yeah? Just as an example. And I give you another example from reality, from my country, Western country, Austria, the middle of Europe. Just think of old people's homes. Yeah? Many of them suffering from dementia. They don't even know their name, but they have the right to vote still. Should I tell you who votes for them? They do vote with letter, but I can tell you who fills out the letter. It's the headmaster of the home, of the asylum they live in. And in Austria, every asylum is connected over some organization to a certain party. And we have very, very funny results in old people's asylum, I can tell you. Always depending on what organization is running that asylum and to what party it is. It is linked, it is connected. We know it, and this is the Western country. I don't know. Okay. And last topic, internet voting. We tried it in Austria for our students, the representation for our students' chamber, and you know that, yeah. Okay. Our high court forbid internet voting because of our experience in that election for our students' chamber for very, very good reasons. So I believe we have enough problems with our conventional paper way of voting. I could bring examples more than we have time. But we should not add new problems through new technologies that don't solve the old problems, but bring us new problems. So the opposite is the case. We increase the problems that we do already have with new technologies. And I would be happy if anybody would come to change my opinion, but I'm afraid no way. Thank you.
Thank you. Comments?
Thank you for this intervention, of course, coming from my home country. That allows me to give some insights on that as well, the other way around, but of course I share your statement at the end that exactly this is the point, right? When you introduce technology, you need to bear in mind what problems does it actually try to solve, right? There are some areas where technology can actually really do good, and that is, for example, large volumes of elections. Think about booklets, like in Hamburg, where you have to cast up to 50 votes in one election round, right? Think about Orange County in the US, where 10 million voters do similar. It's just not possible to count that in a reasonable time by hand. Or if you invest, of course, the amount of manual labor to do it. That's also totally fine, right? You always have to strike a balance. I'm not saying that that is the ideal. It is, of course, when we talk about democracy, it is about the people that rule, should also be linked directly to the ones that are being ruled, right? If we have that connection, that is what we believe in democracy, right? And so it should be immediately accessible how the elections are being run, and when we introduce technology, it provides a barrier. But we also need to take account that elections are never secret without technology. If we take that paper is also technology, right? We talk about marbles, we talk about palm leaves, and so on and so on. So to some extent, it's just a logical continuation. But I fully agree that, and I tried to say that during my presentation, that we only talk about distributing information in different ways. If you have all information available, such as fingerprint databases, right, there is not even a secret paper-based election, right? And so something like what you have described in Kyrgyzstan, where the voters' fingerprints are being taken and then they are also put on a paper ballot, that is something where I would have certain concerns as an individual, right? Because it would be similarly a problem in Austria and Germany if such things would happen. So we always have to assume how distributed is the information.
knowing that when we have all information, there is no secret election. And a technological system, of course, makes linking information easier. With a scanner, without additional means, it's very hard to also scan fingerprints. That's not invented, according to my knowledge, so you need to have certain additional measures to also find that fingerprint on there. But essentially, it's about distributing information, right? So zero knowledge proofs help to some extent. That's what we use with ATMs, with bank vending machines, right? They help us to, without the machine knowing my PIN code, I can prove that I know the PIN code, and so on. And there are other technologies as well, like blind signatures, which are also used for Bitcoin these days, right? They allow to prove to another party that you hold an eligible token without the other party actually knowing the token. And so there are plenty of technologies, there are plenty of things, but it comes down to the essential element: how much does the individual voter know? How much does he or she need to know? And how easy is it to understand? And then you need to strike the balance. Is that something that does something good for my democracy or not, right? And that's as easy as that. When it comes to internet voting, that's a similar issue. With internet voting, you need to make sure that you can identify the voter and to keep his or her vote secret, right? You can only do so with cryptography, right? And you need to distribute it through different servers. If you have all the information, if you have the secret key of the election, if you have the secret key of the voter, if you have the internet communication, there is no secret election. It depends on how you secure the election. If you do it like the Estonians, that you have a personal ID card which keeps that secret on that card, you can be at least sure that for the next 30 years your vote is being kept secret. After 30 years, there is no secret election. The question is your vote then interesting? If you say that it has to be secure forever, okay, then forget about the Estonian system, right? About vote buying, I think there are different elements there. Postal voting and internet voting share the same problem: voter coercion and vote buying. That is not circumventable. However, it can be reduced. Like, for example, the Estonians, they also have to rethought their process. They said, you can just cast your vote as often as you want, right? You can sell your vote once, you can sell it twice, you can sell it 3 times, and if you don't like it at all, you just go back to the polling station and cast your vote on paper, and that cancels the internet vote. It doesn't solve the problem completely, but it does take away the problems quite a bit, right? When it comes to the Austrian election, in the end, the Constitutional Court lifted the regulation because it didn't comply with the need to secrecy, because it didn't explain it in the regulation, but it didn't forbid or actually say that it's impossible to do so in Austria. And the Austrian solution actually just needs a 2/3 majority, and then you can do whatever, right? Same thing as with postal voting. So that just to make it more concrete, but certainly the one thing that was learned in the Austrian student election is that without the public confidence of both the voters and the elected officials, it's hard to do an introduction of technology to such a process, because the political debate needs to be done to convince those that are involved that this is a reasonable way to do it. And that was not done in the Austrian case, and that's the important learning here. I won't talk so much about the technology, because that were all failures in there, about the citizen card, about the identity things, and so on and so on. That it was trying to do, and technologically it was actually a project that helped a lot to improve the Austrian e-government system, but politically, let's not even go there. But that was where the problem lay, and that's what other countries could learn from such a case.
I'll be very brief. I think I saw you nodding, so I think you're listening to an example of when technology solutions are not always coming from, let's say, hackers. We always try to think, we tend to think about technology as a little bit of a danger. We use it, yes, we log in to the phone, we use email, we send things that we don't want to be in a public domain by email, and we always we keep using it, we keep doing it. We keep doing banking online, but we always think about, oh, there is a threat. And that's, I think, a very proper way to think about it when we're discussing such a fundamental topic as democracy and elections. But at the same time, there are technological advances being made, and there are good people, there are good hackers, so to say, as well, trying to resolve these things. What is important, however, is that there is also always a scope for decision making in the parliaments by the election administration, and it needs to be maintained, and it needs to be guided by resolving problems that really exist. For you, it might not be the issue that some people are disenfranchised. For some others, it could be. There are different opinions held in every single parliament, and there needs to be a debate that is essentially political, essentially values-based, essentially based on understanding and discussing what does it mean, this standard or that standard, and how important is it to maintain it. It is, as Robert was saying, a balance. And once the decision makers find this kind of balance and have an idea of where they want to move, in which direction, then the discussion becomes technical. And I think it's not always important to understand the very tiniest details of technology, but it is important to know what kind of questions to ask. And being experienced decision makers, you can probably judge very often when somebody is trying not to answer your question. And that is something that we do as observers as well. We ask very tough questions. We go back in the documentation, and we see issues coming up early on that were sometimes neglected. Sometimes it is the resolution to it is technical, sometimes the resolution is purely political decision making. So there is a mix in this. We can't think about the technology as just pure, a whole room of strange internet geeks working on some kind of solution. In the end of the day, there are people who make decisions behind it, and they are not necessarily technical gurus. And the same applies to, let's say, social networks. Now we can see a bit of a trend of social networks claiming that we are self-regulating. We're weeding out some of the fake news. They're saying, oh, but this looks like a fake news campaign. I still don't know what exactly fake news means. I haven't seen a good enough definition for that yet. But the question that I ask, and a lot of my colleagues ask, why should I trust the tech giants to make these decisions for me? And I can ask the same question to the election administration sometimes. Could you please demonstrate to me once again that you're trustworthy? And this is something where we agree completely, and if you allow me, I'm going to be using this phrase in the future, that what we need is a transparent system and a transparent government and not a transparent citizen. And if the citizen sees that the government and technology is transparent, maybe he or she will be more willing to become a little bit more transparent herself or himself, and give a little bit more of the biometrics, other information, and take part in this process. But in the end of the day, it's all about public trust as the first step in the process, not as the goal of introducing technologies.
Thank you very much. Are there any more questions? I have one question. After I looked into this handbook, and this handbook is mentioning several analysts participating in the EOMs. And when it comes to new voting technologies, it's mentioned NBT analysts. And my question is there always an NBT analyst participating in election observation missions when the state used some sort of NBTs? And the other question is, how easy is it for UDIR to recruit those sorts of analysts with the right skills?
The answer to the first question is no, not always. It very much depends on the extent of the use of the new voting technologies. If it's used on a massive scale, or if it's used in a very peculiar moment in time, let's say for the first time, or there is a meaningful pilot that is taking place with regard to the new voting technologies, then yes, we could decide to send a specific new voting technologies analyst. However, what we hope for is that our election analysts are also, they also know the handbook very well, and they are able to apply the methodology that is in this handbook to their work when they're observing some elements of the MBT. We also have specific resource people in the headquarters who are there to advise the analysts, not to do their job for them, not to observe or reach conclusions, but to advise them with regard to methodology and potentially questions that need to be asked. But it's not always necessary to have a dedicated MBT analyst. In terms of how easy are they to recruit, well, I'll put it this way, it's a growing field. There are people who are studying it up because they also follow the trend of this becoming more used, and they know that there is a job to be done. At the same time, I think there are relatively few people who keep up with the technology developments to the level that we demand from our analysts. I would say maybe there's up to 10 people in the world who are satisfactory enough for us to deliver the quality reports that we aim for. And I think among those 10, Robert is probably the number one. But this is this kind of handbooks. They help even those who are maybe not yet fully qualified to also get up to speed. And for those who are maybe not specifically MBT analysts, to be able to apply this in their work as well.
Thank you very much, and thank you all, especially our guests here, for participating in this side event and engaging in this, I think, very important discussion. And I hope that we can continue this discussion in forthcoming meetings, because I think it's very important to have it keep going, so to speak. So I want to thank you all for participating here. Thank you.
Appreciate it. If you want